Alright, welcome back. So in this lecture we're going to continue setting up our hatchet equipable and setting up the spawn equipable third person event. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So go ahead and open up your first person character class and head over to the event graph to the spawn equipable third person. So let's go ahead and implement that functionality. So now what we want to do is take this equipped index, promote this to a variable, and just leave it like that. I believe we use this variable in a later lecture for when we do things like item durability. But for now, we'll just leave it like that. And then what we'll do is do a spawn actor from class. And so what this spawn actor does is it spawns a blueprint or an actor depending on what class you have selected. So if you expand this, you see we have all sorts of blueprint classes we could spawn. But what we need to do is just hook up the class like so. And for the spawn transformation, just right click and split pin structure. And we can leave this all at 0 because we're going to attach it to our character's hand. Okay. And then what we can do is get our third person equipped item and get it on the graph and set it. So we're going to set it to this return value, and it looks like we actually need to change this. So I want to change the variable type to a actor object reference, and whenever you do this, it's gonna give you this warning, could break connections, just change variable type, and then just compile save. So we should be all good. So now we can hook up this return value to this third person equipped item. So it just needs to be that actor object reference. Now what we can do is off of this we want to do our get equipable ref message. So this is our interface to get information from our equipable. And so now we have this a reference where we can get equipable info. So we set this variable up in a previous lecture when we were setting up our equipable master class. So if we get that, what we can do is off of this structure we can go ahead and do a break s equipable info. And so now we have these variables that we can use. So things like the socket name, the animation state, and the first person equip class. And so what we'll need to do is go ahead and actually set up a socket for our hatchet. And essentially all that a socket does is it tells us where in our character's hands should we actually equip the hatchet. So let's go into our main folder, actually in our content, man, mesh, full, and open up our sk man underscore full. And if you head over to the skeleton tree here, we should see all the different bones inside of this character's body, on this character's rig. And what we're going to look for is a hand R. And so what we can do is right click this hand R and do this add socket. Okay. So what that did is it created a hand underscore R socket, and we can just double click and rename this to tool socket. And so now what we can do is right click, add a preview asset, and you can add any sort of mesh to preview on that socket. So we want to add our sm underscore hatchet. So now we can make sure you change this camera speed because sometimes it can be really fast and hard to navigate this little viewport. But now what we can do is take this hatchet and rotate this around and basically line this up with our character's hand. And a better way of doing this is using an animation to preview this. So if you hit this little preview animation, we can search for hatchet idle, and then we can take this little timeline and just pause it. And now what we can do is we can actually go ahead and position this, rotate it, and you might need to turn off things like the snapping, so just turn off the rotation snapping so that we can get a smoother rotation. And basically we can just position this however we want it. Now if you want perfect values, or the values that I use, you can just enter in the transform values that I'm going to add. And so to do that, select the tool socket here, and we actually need a details panel. I'm not sure why I don't have a details panel up here, but let's go to window, and we should have details, so click on that. So we should have this little details window here. But if you select this tool socket, we can see the location, the X, Y, and Z. And so I'm just going to set this to -4.57. And the Y, I'm going to set this to 1.66. And for the Z, I'll set this to -17. For the rotation, I'll set this to 19.9. And then the Y, I'll set that to -0.0. And then for the Z, I'll set this to 70. Okay. So technically this is supposed to be like the first person setup. Basically, you'll be kind of viewing it sort of like this. So you guys can enter in those values if you want the precise placement, or you can mess around with the placement. It's up to you. But now we have this tool socket, and so we need to use that for the socket name. Okay. So in our content browser, we go to our items and go find our hatchet equipable. So in our equipables tools, so all we want to do is go over to our hatchet folder in here, and we should have our stone hatchet, TP_stone hatchet. So open that up, and you can either open the full blueprint editor, or you could edit these values here. I'm just going to open up the full blueprint editor. So if you go to your class defaults, here on the right we should have the default equipable info, and under the socket name we're going to name this to tool socket, and under the animation state we want to make sure this is hatchet. And then for the first person equip class, we just need to set this to our BP_FP_stone hatchet. So you can search for, or click this little drop down, and we should have our BP_FP_stone hatchet. Okay, compile, save that. So now we have our socket set up and our equipable info properly set up. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to add another custom event in here. So right click, add custom event, and this will be called multicast weapon equip, and change this to a multicast. Compile, save that, and we want to have a couple of different inputs. So add one input. We're going to name this to target, and for the variable type we want to change this to actor object reference. Compile, save, add another variable. We're going to name this to, change this to the name variable, and name this to socket name. And then the last one we'll change this to a equipable state, and we'll change the name to equipped state. Compile, save. So we can call this event. After we get this info, we can do our multicast weapon equip. And so for the target, we can hook up our third person equipped item. For the socket name, we can hook up the socket name. For the animation state, we'll get that up for the equipped state. Okay. And so essentially what this event is doing is we have it set to a multicast, which basically means that execute this event for all clients who are in viewing distance of this character. Okay. So basically all the clients who are near this player can see this item being equipped on their hand. That's pretty much all that a multicast does. So what we want to do is actually attach this actor that we spawned to our character's hand. So first thing what we want to do is off this target, we want to do a is valid, this little question mark. So we want to make sure and check and see if this is valid. So now what we want to do is off this target, do a attach actor to component. So we're just attaching this actor that we're spawning in, this third person equipped item, to a component which will be our third person mesh. So take our third person mesh and get it on the graph. Right click this and convert this to a validated get. And hook this up for the is valid. And for the is valid, we want to attach actor to component. For the parent, we want this third person mesh. We want it to be attached to this third person mesh. For the socket name, we can hook up the socket name. And then for these location, rotation, and scale, we want to set this to snap the target so that it will snap to this socket location. Okay. And the last thing we need to do is get our equipped state and set it, and then just hook up our equipped state to this equipped state variable so that will set the animation. Okay, compile, save that. And so right now technically we could go ahead and test this out. Right now it's only going to work for the third person, but we need to go ahead and spawn an item in our hotbar first. So what we can do is we can use this add item debug, and we're actually using the same one key over here for our hotbar. So let's go ahead and just delete that and add a new key. We'll add maybe the R key. So the R key on our keyboard. And then what we want to do is add row number 2. So this is our little hatchet item. And instead of adding it to our inventory, let's go ahead and delete this and add it to our player hotbar. So let's go ahead and test and see if we can equip this item. And what we'll need to do is play this with 2 players, because right now we only have this third person item being spawned. We don't have the first person one spawned yet. So we can go ahead and hit play. And it looks like we're playing this animation by default, the hatchet animation. And that's because in our character here we have this equipped state variable. We have it set to hatchet. So if we set this back to default, compile, save that, it should set our animation back to the default. Okay. Now before we actually go ahead and add this item, what we need to do is we haven't set up the updating of our hotbar UI. So what I mean by this is when we do this add item on server, if we double click this function, what this does is it adds an item, and then inside of here it calls this update UI, and then calls this update item slot. Okay, so this update item slot, right now we only have this programmed for our W inventory instead of our W hotbar. So we need to add the update slot for our hotbar as well. And so what we're going to do is add a function inside of our player controller here. So open up your survival game underscore PC, should just be in your blueprints, and we're going to add a function and name this to get inventory widget. So this will have 2 inputs. The first one will be e underscore container type. So our e container type enumeration, you just do container. And the next one will be a integer, and we'll change this to slot index. So for the container, what we want to do is do a select. Okay. And then what we want to do is in our event graph, let's just copy this main widget ref, w inventory, w item container grid, and the slots and this get function. Copy that and paste it inside of here. So all we're doing is we're getting our main widget ref, our inventory widget, this item's container grid, and we're returning, or we're going to return the slot or the single widget reference that we need to update. So unhook this container grid. We want to hook this up for our player inventory. So now what we should have is a little pin for our hotbar that we can hook up. So to get our hotbar, we just want to copy and paste our main widget reference. Off of here, get w underscore hotbar. And then we want to get that item container grid because that's what stores the item widgets. Okay, so get w item container grid, and then hook that up for the hotbar. And then what we want to do is off this return value, we want to get the slots array inside of that item's container grid. And then at this slot index, we'll hook this up for the get. Basically, we're just getting this single slot depending on which container we have selected, okay? So this function will make it work so that we can update our inventory slot depending on which inventory we're updating. So it can update either our player inventory or hotbar, our storage, or our armor. Okay. Now we need to add a return node, so select our get inventory widget and add an output, and alt unconnect that. And for our output, we just need to change this to a w underscore inventory slot object reference. So hook up the execution pin and then hook up this get into the return value and rename this to widget. Okay, compile, save. And then in our event graph here, what we can do is delete all of this up into this is valid, and then we can call that get inventory widget. We can hook up the execution pin for the container, hook up the container for the index, hook up the slot index, and then off of here we'll just do an is valid check, and if it is valid we want to get this little widget and update the slot. Okay, so we can do this the same exact thing for our reset slot. So delete all this, and then add in our get inventory widget, hook up the execution pin, the container, index, the is valid, and our widget to the is valid check, and then finally hook up the widget to the reset slot. Okay, so just a little bit more cleaner way of doing things, and this function will now be set up to update whichever item slot depending on which type of inventory we have. Okay, and so the last thing that we need to do is in our BPC items container. So in our inventory BPC items container here, we also need to open up this update UI function, and basically we have the switch on container type. And so all we need to do is hook up this hotbar to this get controller from character, update item slot. So all this is doing is calling that update item slot, and since our inventory hotbar are basically updating the UI the same. We can hook those two up. I believe the storage is the only one that's different, but right now that should be all good to go. So if we hit play now, we can hit our little debug key, which I think was R. So now we have our hatchet item. So if I press 1, it says equip the item. And it looks like right now we're getting this little bug. Okay, so that's totally fine. So you can see right now when I walk around, it's super glitchy. And that's because we forgot to disable collisions on our hatchet. So if we go to our items, equipables, tools, and in our BP underscore TP hatchet, select this static mesh here. So just the static mesh, there shouldn't be a mesh here, but in the details panel we have a collision presets. What we can do is set this to no collision, compile, save that, and open up the first person one, select the static mesh. We'll also set this one to no collision, compile, save that. So we should hit play and we shouldn't see that glitching. And so right now when I press R and press 1, we can't actually see what's going on. I believe I know the root of this issue, and so this is a good valuable lesson. So the main reason why this is not working is if we go into our items folder here, and if we open up our master item, we actually forgot to click one checkbox. Okay, so we want to make sure we click this checkbox here, replicates. So if you open up you can either open up the full blueprint editor here, go to the class defaults, and we have this replicates. Okay, so we want to make sure we set that to true, compile, save that. And so basically what this replicates does is this essentially means should this item be able to replicate or be used in multiplayer. Okay, so we can go ahead and play test this again. Hit R on our keyboard, press 1, and so now we have our hatchet equipped. Okay, but what you're going to see are two more different issues. Okay, so in the bottom right there, you can see that the third person looks completely fine, but currently in the first person, what we need to do is we need to set this third person item, we need to make that hidden for the first person, and then what we need to do is spawn in a first person item and equip that to our first person hands. Okay, so the first things first, to make that hatchet invisible for the first person, if you go into the equipables and in the tools and in this BP underscore TP hatchet, with this static mesh selected, we want to search for a setting called owner no C. Okay, so if this is set to true, the component won't be visible in the actor's view. Okay, so click this checkbox and make sure that's the static mesh here inside of the BP third person hatchet. So now in our character, in our graph here, all we need to do is set the owner of this item. So go ahead and move this over, and then off of this third person equipped item we can just do set owner, and for the new owner we just drag up here and get reference to self and hook this up like so, compile, save that. So now if we hit play, we shouldn't see it in the first person, so we can click our R key to add a hatchet, press 1. So now we don't see it in the first person, but the other player can see it in the third person. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to add the first person mesh that gets spawned in. and attach to our player's hand. Okay. So in our character, we want to, down here, right click, add custom event, and rename this to spawn equipable first person, and set this to run on owning client. Compile, save that. So for our first person, we're just going to spawn the mesh only on the client. Basically, the client is the only one who should see the first person item. Okay, we don't want other people to see the first person equipped item, because they're going to be seeing this third person item instead. Okay, so this function, so this event will need two inputs. The first one being a actor class reference. Rename this to class. And the next one will be of the type name. This will be our socket name. Compile, save that. And off this class, we'll do a spawn actor. And we'll right click the spawn transform, do a split struct pin. So we'll just spawn it at 0, 0. And then what we'll do is we'll take off of this return value and promote this to a variable, and just name this to first person equipped item. And then off of here, we'll do a attach actor to component. Okay. And so for the parent that we want to attach it to, we want to attach it to this first person mesh. So go ahead and drag and hook that up. For the socket name, we'll hook up the socket name like that. And then we'll set this all to snap to target, and snap the target. Compile, save that. And then all we have to do is call this little event right up here. So we'll do a spawn equipable first person. And for this class, we just hook up this first person equipped class. And for the socket name, we can hook up the socket name like so. So now we should be able to see this in action. So if we hit play, hit R on my keyboard, we add that item to our hotbar, press 1. So now I can see this hatchet equipped in my hand. And then the player sees my third person hatchet equipped in this hand. Okay, and we can also see the animations working as well. So when I run, you can see the hatchet moving with the run animation. And we may need to tweak later on like the position of this hatchet, because right now it's like way in the middle of the screen. So we'll go ahead and adjust that. But as you can see, we can see it from our other player's view. And if we want, we can also press R and equip a hatchet for this character as well. Okay. Basically what we did, to recap here, is we added these hotbar keys that call this event that basically checks to see if we have an item equipped on our hotbar. If we don't have this item equipped, we do this spawn third person equipable, which basically just spawns the third person item class, in this case our hatchet. We set the owner, that way it's not visible in the first person. And then we get the equipable info, which hold things like the socket name, animation to play, and the first person class. Then we call this multicast weapon equip, which basically attaches the hatchet to our player's hand. And then we set the proper animation state. And then for our first person, we spawn the first person mesh and attach it to our first person hand. So in our next lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to set up de-equipping the item. So when you press the hotbar key again, what it will do is it will de-equip the item from our hand and we'll go back to the resting animation. So with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next lecture.